The Alpha Legion's lore has changed a lot over the years. But of course, the way Games Workshop has done this has left us with a lot of questions, and members of the community still quoting old, outdated lore as canon. In this video, I'm going to debunk one of the biggest misconceptions in Warhammer 40k, and take a look at the death of Alpharius at the hands of Rabute Guilliman on Eskrador. And before you say, "Hey Inquisitor, Solomon Akura mentions Eskrador in Harrowmaster, so it's canon now, again." We'll get to that at the end of the video. But I'd like to start with explaining where this tidbit of lore comes from. A piece of Warhammer history that gets thrown around a lot in YouTube comments, as if it has a ton of weight behind it. And let me tell you guys, it does not. And even in universe, at the time, was quite questionable, possibly heretical in origin. Next time your friends tell you that it is 100% confirmed that Guilliman killed Alpharius, you can just show them this video instead of giving them the usual clop in the chops that is likely to result in even more brain damage than they already suffer from. So let's get into this old lore from 2003. Yeah, it is from years before the Horus Heresy series came out, or there was even a tabletop game for it. At this time, the heresy and what we knew of the Primarchs was all just deep lore within the lore of Warhammer 40k. Eventually, Games Workshop started giving us little updates about this backstory in the form of Index Astartes articles in White Dwarf. So, this most epic of battles that Ultramarines simps love to gloat over came from White Dwarf 277 in the UK and 276 in the US edition. Let that sink in. I must have heard about how Guilliman killed Alpharius in the books like 1,000 times now. But yes, it was just an Index Astartes article on the Alpha Legion. And everything else, I mean literally everything else in this article has been changed in the lore since then. So why is this epic battle somehow still canon? I don't understand. And I mean still canon in massive air quotes. As when we look at where the account comes from, it is delivered to us from an Inquisitor Craven, and this particular Inquisitor was later accused of heresy, of being an agent of the ruinous powers, and, if I recall correctly, was burnt at the stake for this heresy. Nothing he said can be considered reliable and honest. But that said, let's see what this heretic has to say about the Alpha Legion and their Primarch Alpharius. At this time, Games Workshop had not yet invented Omegon. There was only Alpharius. So he's not found in the usual way, but in this old lore, he was found by Horus as the War Master was prosecuting a war against a non-compliant human civilization. His flagship was attacked by a bunch of small, ineffective, hit-and-run attacks from 1- and 2-man fighters. So he took the bait and followed those small ships into a minefield, intending to unleash the wrath of the Imperium upon them. As the mines blew massive holes in Horus's flagship, which I'm unsure if it was yet to be named the Vengeful Spirit, a strike team of this world's elite commandos boarded the War Master's flagship, and were shot in the head almost immediately upon arrival. But one dodged aside, taking only a slight graze on the cheek by a bolt round, and striding right up to Horus, meeting face to face, shrugging off bolter fire, taking only minor damage from it. The warrior was the equal in stature to the War Master, a massive giant with green eyes, a full foot taller than the sons of Horus Astartes on the deck. And the fire ceased as Horus raised a hand, gesturing to his sons that it was okay, as Horus and Alpharius met for the first time, recognizing each other as brothers immediately. Horus Lupercal had found the last of the Primarchs. And Horus and Alpharius kept this a secret from the Emperor for months while they got to know one another and learned from each other, plotting, bonding, planning, and scheming. The two brothers developed a close bond, but when Alpharius was revealed to the Emperor and his other brothers, he made no other friends. Guilliman was a total dick to him, literally just talked shit to him and turned his nose up like he was better than Alpharius. Basically, Alpharius was proud of how he had trained his legion and officers to take initiative and adapt to any situation. Alpharius was told by Guilliman what actual and proper Space Marine tactics were, and that his style of subterfuge and coordinated attacks were anything but codex actions. Yeah, even in this pre-heresy point, even in this old, outdated lore, Guilliman was up his own ass about how great he was at war and how awesome his legion was, and was already writing the Codex Astartes and trying to bully his brothers into adopting his style of fighting. And Alpharius wasn't hearing anything about this from Guilliman. He was a bit taken aback that his brothers all thought his style of fighting dishonorable or cowardly, even though he had defeated an army that outnumbered him 100 to 1. Alpharius had let this army dig in and take strong strategic defenses for days or even weeks ahead of time. And this is what his brothers were so critical of, because to them, they saw an enemy and just wanted to charge right in, like Space Marines usually do. But Alpharius had sown the seeds of deception throughout the enemy's ranks, and had infiltrated from within, placing operatives far ahead of time, and when the moment to strike came, the enemy found a massive hole in their main line as a series of massive explosions wiped out much of their defenses, and more explosions decimated the enemy from deep within their bastions and fortifications. By the time they knew what hit them, it was over, and for this Alpharius was expecting to be praised, yet only Horus Lupercal showed him any respect for a job well done. Guilliman told Alpharius that he and his legion would never amount to anything, and that the Ultramarines already had centuries of honors and victories under their belts, that the Alpha Legion would forever be in their shadow. But Alpharius was asked why he didn't take the normal Space Marine route of just attacking them head-on, and was criticized for the perfectly executed action he conducted taking too long. He simply stated, "That would have been too easy." And it is this sort of snarky, put-you-in-your-place, quippy type of personality that made all his brothers think Alpharius was a dick. Even his name and that of his legion was a slight, a jab at Lionel Johnson and the 1st Legion, the Dark Angels. Nobody really knew what to make of him, and Alpharius spent very little time with the Emperor getting to know him, and even less with his brothers, except for Horus. So in many ways, the Alpharius of 2003 is very similar to the one we have now, since the character has been fleshed out a lot more in the Horus Heresy series. But keep in mind that at this point in time, we really only had 2 sources for art of the Alpha Legion's Primarch. We had the original John Blanche piece, and we had the art from the Horus Heresy collectible card game. And I have to say that the original concept for Alpharius was a far cry from what he looks like today. Wild, spiky hair, almost like one of the Wood Elf models from Warhammer Fantasy Battles. And elegant, finely fitting armor that did not flare at the ankles, but was something more akin to Sanguinius's armor. But the dynamic between Alpharius and his brothers was pretty much exactly the same as it is today. He was an outsider who was never accepted or understood by his brothers. And that was really no sweat to him, because he didn't really want much to do with them either and considered himself completely superior to all of them, while at the same time letting them all underestimate him. So he still had those tropes of being the perfect infiltrator, the perfect spy. It is not known if he was reporting all that he learned and did to Horus, but it is known that he did not do so with the Emperor. It's thought, however, by this Inquisitor Craven, that Alpharius was not honest with the War Master either. That just by his very nature, Alpharius always kept some of his cards close to his chest, and many of his thoughts and actions to himself and his legion. And when it comes to legions, this version of the Alpha Legion is pretty much the same as it is now. They differed greatly from all the other legions and operated in ways that Guilliman would have found absolutely heretical. Particularly, by not adhering to a rigid command structure, the Legion was able to present any Astartes they needed to as Alpharius, and that did not sit well with Guilliman. He considered it disrespectful to the name of a Primarch that a mere Astartes could be allowed to use it. To Alpharius, his name was nothing more than a tool, nothing more than syllables strung together to identify him. But by using it the way he was, it had been allowed to become something more. Guilliman didn't see it that way. Nor did he like the fact that the Alpha Legion used regular, unaugmented humans as operatives and even trusted advisors, allowing secrets to be shared with beings that Guilliman considered inferior. To Alpharius, all his operatives were tools, and he was doing the Emperor's will. So how could he be wrong to use the right tool for the job when it was by the will of their father? So the stage is set for the two brothers to butt heads. They disagree more on everything, from tactics to the basic roles of their legions, on an absolutely fundamental level that just cannot be reconciled. Guilliman actually wants to do something about this, and intends to bring Alpharius before their father and be questioned / face justice. But this is overshadowed by Conrad Kurz being put on the spotlight as the Night Lord's terror tactics came into focus and became the focus of attention, and the relationship between the Imperium and the Night Lords and their Primarch fell apart. But before Guilliman could see Alpharius thrown to the wolves, the Horus heresy broke out. And this is the fun part. In this account, the Inquisitor known as Craven does not truly know if the Alpha Legion actually participated in the Dropsite massacre on Istvaan V. He openly states that some sources account for their being there, and others do not. However, even in this Inquisitor's journal, we see later that there is no doubt that the Alpha Legion sided with Horus, although it is interesting that they may or may not have participated at the battle on Istvaan V. And that battle is much different in this old lore. This questionable journal of Craven's, it suggests that there were only 30,000 total Loyalist Marines there, and that out of those 30,000 Iron Hands, Raven Guard, and Salamanders, only 5 Marines total survived. Literally 5. Somehow they got away. I'm glad that this part of the history has been updated to reflect more accurate numbers. But whether or not the Alpha Legion was on the ground, Inquisitor Craven openly states that he believes the trap to have been orchestrated by either Alpharius alone or Alpharius and Horus coming up with it together. Either way, he thought that it had the feel of Alpharius all over it, and I for one can agree with that. He knew baiting others into traps better than anyone. But as the Horus heresy dragged on and the Solar War kicked into full gear, the Ultramarines and the Alpha Legion would come to blows on the planet of Eskrador. Now, it is not known to Craven whether or not the Ultramarines found the Alpha Legion and chased them to Eskrador, or if the Alpha Legion baited them. There's evidence to suggest both, but either way, the battle between the 13th and 20th Legions would delay Guilliman from relieving the Loyalists and providing reinforcements against Horus and the traitor legions assaulting Terra. So, knowing that the Ultramarines had the much larger and more powerful fleet, Alpharius chose to face Guilliman on the ground, and so made Planetfall first. He established a base there and dug into a fortified position high in a mountain range at one of the planet's poles. Guilliman and the Ultramarines came down, wanting to revenge themselves upon one of the traitor legions. But they were systematically cut to pieces. Their tanks and vehicles were no good in the terrain, and every single tactic they used was one with which Alpharius was familiar, because he was smart. He was smart enough to read Guilliman's Codex Astartes that he wouldn't shut up about, so Alpharius literally had access to Guilliman's playbook. After getting bogged down and ground down in a brutal war, Guilliman finally decides to do something out of character and leads an assault on the command center of the Alpha Legion. He does something that wasn't in his playbook, and he teleports a force right in and deploys others via Thunderhawk dropship, assaulting the Alpha Legion command and Alpharius directly. Funny how Guilliman just didn't get it at all, even then. What happened when Hercules, or Heracles, cut off the Hydra's head in mythology? 2 more grew back in its place, but I digress. The attack was unsupported, and the attackers had no supply lines at all. They were basically making a last-ditch effort to root out the Alpha Legion, and the surviving account, which Inquisitor Craven uses as his supporting argument for what happened, has been brought into question. It is the account of an Ultramarine sergeant, possibly, a member of the strike force of some 3,000 Marines who assaulted the Alpha Legion HQ. But the validity of the document has been questioned by many Inquisitors, as well as the Ultramarines themselves. Despite being deemed as pretty much fictitious by both the Inquisition and the Ultramarines, this account still made its way into Inquisitor Craven's diatribe Lessons of Strife. I must also point out that at this time, Games Workshop was still regularly referring to Terra as Earth, and the documents that Inquisitor Craven claimed were the Ultramarines' account of events were found somewhere earthward of Eskrador. That doesn't sound too awful convincing, does it? Anyway, what happened is a bloody battle where the Alpha Legionnaires found themselves outnumbered 5-1. And I must tip my hat to Guilliman, even though this definitely didn't happen, for taking the Alpha Legion off guard. That cannot be an easy thing to do. So the Ultramarine goes on to say that they pressed the attack despite horrific losses, and the Alpha Legion was chewing through them with their heavy weapons stationed on higher ground and fortified positions. But he gives some hokey line about their resolve and states the Alpha Legion had too few guns to take them all down. By this time, the Ultramarines have whittled the Alpha Legion down to around 500 Marines left, fighting at the command center. So Alpharius leads a charge himself, down the mountain, and just starts butchering Ultramarines. The Marine giving his account says that none could stand before the might of the Primarch, and many were cut down by his power sword. Yes, this is before they had really defined Alpharius much. In fact, this bit from 2003 is literally the first thing I ever remember reading about him in any lore anywhere that was more than a line or two. But yeah, there's no Pale Spear yet. And the Primarch fights with his power sword. Although at one other point in the account, it's mentioned he's using a chain sword, but then it's right back to a power sword. Probably typo. The next thing that happens is the Ultramarines advance halts in the face of the Primarch, and the viewpoint character states he was forced to recite the Canticles of Faith, which just goes to show you how early this lore really was. There was no Imperial truth yet. The Space Marines were praying during the heresy? So yeah, this is before they had given us any real details at all about the heresy. So as the Marine is praying, Guilliman strides forward like a total boss and comes to meet Alpharius, ignoring all the carnage and slaughter playing out all around him, walking through gunfire and blades swinging, chain swords whirring, and Space Marines dying. He makes straight for the Hydra. The battle was nothing like any other Primarch battle we have ever seen. I think of it a lot like the end of Kill Bill Volume 1 and the duel with Lucy Lawless. But it's quick, so I'll quote it so you know exactly what was said to have happened. Again, said by a very, very disreputable source, or so the Imperium claims now, 10,000 years later. The two Primarchs stood before each other. They were equal in stature, both clad in shining power armor and each wielding a glittering power sword. But where one was noble, the other was craven. Where one was loyal, the other was a betrayer. All other combat ceased as we watched them. There was a long pause, neither Primarch moving an inch. Then both struck in an instant. Each sword made a single stroke, then both were still again. For a second, the two great men stood, facing, before Alpharius slumped to the ground. So, after the Primarch fell, they killed the rest of the Alpha Legionnaires at the command center, and then held a vigil for Alpharius before commencing the fight against the other sons of the Hydra on Eskrador. They burned his body on a pyre, and Guilliman allowed his Marines a moment of reflection and prayer. Again, this should show you how old and outdated this account is. Even if it weren't a lie in-universe, it would still be more of an ancient myth and legend type of account. But the Alpha Legion was supposedly undeterred by the loss of the Primarch, which took the Ultramarines off guard. They proceeded to all but wipe out the Ultramarines on Eskrador, operating with complete, unrelenting efficiency, something the Ultramarines knew they would not have been able to do themselves had Rebute Guilliman died, which by the time the fighting on Eskrador was over, nearly happened. Guilliman barely got away. His legion was nearly obliterated, and he didn't get to go reinforce Terra, so it went down as a huge L for the Blueberries and a W for the Hydras, despite the apparent loss of Alpharius. Now, what is really interesting is that this Index Astartes article ends with a snippet about the Aquila Conclave, and explains the context in which Inquisitor Craven's account is to be considered. And remember, I said this guy was not to be trusted? Well, it seems the Inquisition at the time thought so too. Again, quoting the source material directly. It has never been established if members of the Alpha Legion exhibit the same unnatural longevity as other Chaos Space Marines, who can apparently live for many thousands of years. This phenomenon is greatly attributed to the Traitor Legion's existence in the Eye of Terror, where the laws of time and space do not apply, so it would follow that the Alpha Legion would not be affected. However, if Alpha Legion Space Marines have more normal lifespans, then one must ask how losses are replaced. In his address to the Aquila Conclave, an impassioned Inquisitor Craven warned, "The only possible answer is that new Chaos Space Marines are being recruited and genetically modified somewhere within the Imperium. And yet Terra refuses to acknowledge that there is even a serious threat. They are all around us, just look over your shoulder. Perhaps when you are murdered in your own cities and in your own homes, then you will see I am right." Shortly after the conclave, Inquisitor Giroux publicly accused Craven of consorting with traitors and conspiring to organize cultist uprisings on the worlds of Cartha IV, V, and Arcos II in the Corin subsector. Giroux challenged Craven to appear for trial and to face the evidence against him. However, Craven's current whereabouts are unknown. Of course, this development has called into question the reliability of all Inquisitor Craven's research. And, as he was the leading scholar of the Alpha Legion's history and current activities, much of what was known about them must now be considered a lie. If, as Giroux claims, Craven has been compromised by the very traitors he sought to investigate, then everything he has said must be considered misinformation and propaganda invented by the Alpha Legion. So everyone, it seems that those who've been clutching the Guilliman killed Alpharius pearls for 22 years now didn't bother to read the text in the window. The best lore was always in those snippets, and they really helped draw us into the universe by adding that extra depth and flavor. Now, if I'm not mistaken, Inquisitor Craven gets burned at the stake for heresy when the Inquisition catches up with him, but I do not remember where that lore actually came from or if I'm misremembering it. His fate is not mentioned in this Index Astartes article, though. But Inquisitor Romanov, what about Solomon Akura mentioning the battle on Eskrador in the book Harrowmaster? Well, what about it? Solomon doesn't have any of the answers when it comes to the history of the Legion or the fate of the Primarchs. He states as much openly. But he's been told the Eskrador story had some truth to it his entire life as a Space Marine, so of course he'd believe it. The other option is that Games Workshop is going to make it canon again, fitting the events into the sort of mold that would be required to make it conform to the Horus Heresy as we know it today. It wouldn't take much effort. But we must also consider Guilliman has never stated he fought Alpharius, but the Alpha Legion did attempt to assassinate him, and nearly succeeded. We'll know what they plan to do with Solomon Akura soon enough, and maybe it will shed more light on Alpharius and his ultimate fate. But keep in mind, this lore of Guilliman versus Alpharius simply came from White Dwarf nearly 22 years ago, before the novels got written, and long before Alpharius even had a twin in the lore. It may as well just be myth and legend, as that is exactly what it is in universe. Shout out to my channel members, you guys are awesome. Hydra Dominatus.